Hey everybody, Nathan Ronan, CFA here with the second part of a two-part series on bond yield conversions, understanding the holding period yield, in this case the money market yield, and the equivalent annual yield. Okay. Now, in the first part of the two-part series, I covered the holding period yield and its relationship to the bond equivalent yield and the effective annual yield. So if you're not familiar with those terminologies, you probably would want to watch the first part of this two-part series first that is posted on my YouTube channel and on social media, and then make the extension to this second part series, because otherwise it may not connect. Okay, now if you are wanting to continue to receive these kinds of updates that I post on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, I highly encourage you to press the subscribe button and the notifications bell right now so that you can be alerted while I put these up every, 7 to 14 days. Okay, Nathan, I'm really struggling here in level 1, or level 2, but usually at level 1, with understanding these yields and memorizing the formulas and which ones are they going to ask and which ones aren't they going to ask and what's the connection. It's a great question. First of all, as an instructor, I never encourage my candidates to try to memorize. The only thing that you can really memorize are rules and regulations. Okay? But I wouldn't really memorize formulas too much, because if you understand the formulas, you can always recreate them because they make sense. And it cuts down on the amount of memorization that you're actually doing. Okay. But one of the areas that a lot of level 1 candidates primarily struggle with is remembering these kinds of yields or these bond conversions and what's the relationship between them and how to adjust them and how to come up with the answer. So I'm going to try to shed light on specifically here the holding period yield, the money market yield, and the effective annual yield. Bottom line, what is a holding period yield? That's the actual return on a money market investment or a money market security, assuming it's held to maturity. Okay? So, for example, you might have a 150-day holding period. Okay? So you would calculate what's the return from day 0 to day 150, and I'm going to show you how to do that in a second. That would give you what is called the holding period yield or the holding period return. You can use those terms interchangeably, and they do on the level 1 exam. So that is the holding period yield or the holding period return. What is the relationship of the holding period yield to the money market return or the return on a money market instrument? Well, the money market yield or the money market rate of return is the annualized version of the holding period yield. Remember I just told you could have a investment for 120 days or 150 days? Well, what would that be? What would be that return on an annualized basis? So the money market yield is the annualized version of that holding period yield based on a 360-day year, and it assumes simple interest. Okay? Now, this is very important, that the money market yield assumes a 360-day year, and it assumes simple interest, no compounding interest. So what you're going to do is you're going to always multiply by 360 over t, for example, okay? Or t over 360, depending on whether you're going this way or that way, which I'll show you in a second. Okay, but remember, money market return, money market instruments are always quoted on a 360-day calendar year, whereas the effective annual yield is the annualized version of the holding period yield, but it's based on a 365-day year, and it assumes compounded interest. Now, the effective annual yield, as I told you in the first part of this two-part series, the effective annual yield will always have an exponent or a square root, depending on whether you're going forward or backwards. So it's always going to be some kind of exponent or square root, whereas the money market yield will just be simple math or simple interest or simple computation. That's really important to understand the distinction. And the money market yield is based on a 360-day year, whereas the effective annual yield is based on a 365-day year. Very important. That's the key distinctions between them. Now, why do we have these different forms of yields? Why don't we just have one yield? Everybody can calculate it and it's done. Because we want to put things on an equal basis, on an equality basis, depending on the time frame that we're looking at. So if we're getting a 4% rate of return over 150 days or 120 days or 180 days, what is that equivalent to on a full year basis, based on a 360-day year and based on a 365-day year. Why is that important? So that if we have multiple investments that we're looking at, we can compare them on a apples to apples basis. How can you compare 2.4% for 120 days with 6.3% for a full year, 360-day years, and 6.1% for 365 days? That's what the holding period yield, the money market yield, and the effective annual yield are actually doing for you. So now that we understand what we're doing, that we're trying to create an apples to apples comparison, let's talk about what the formulas are and then go through an example. The holding period yield, very easy. What's the face value of the investment at maturity? Minus the purchase price that you paid for it. Divide that difference by the purchase price. So think of it as final value minus current value over current value, or P1 minus P0 over P0, where P1 is the ending price, the P0 is the purchase price, and you're dividing that difference by the original purchase price. That's your holding period return or your holding period yield over that time frame. Now let's take a look at the money market yield. The money market yield, or the money market discount rate, would take the holding period yield, right, that for whatever it was, 120 days or 150 days or 160 days or 170 days, whatever it is, and then it would multiply it by 360 over t. Just multiply, not exponents, multiply by 360 over t, because again, the money market yields assume a 360-day year. And what you're doing is you're taking that holding period yield and now you are annualizing it based on a 360-day year. So you're putting it on an annual basis. You're taking that yield that you had for 120 days or 150 days, and now you're saying, what is this equivalent to on an annual basis? By just multiplying it by 360 over t. Okay. Now, you could take that formula that says that the money market yield is equal to the holding period yield times 360 over t, and then you could solve for the holding period yield, okay? You could just get the holding period yield alone, and that would be that the holding period yield, just manipulating that formula, is equal to the money market rate of return times t over 360. Not 360 over t, but t over 360. Just write it out based on what I just told you, and you could see how the math is working. So you would say that the holding period yield is equal to the money market yield times t over 360. In other words, you're taking that money market yield, which is on a annual basis, and you're de-annualizing it to a holding period yield based on t over 360. That's pretty straightforward. Now let's talk about the effective annual yield. Nathan told me that the effective annual yield, I'm always going to remember this, is I got to have an exponent or a square root. Okay, correct. So what is the effective annual yield? The effective annual yield is going to be higher than the money market yield because it's based on a 365-day year, not a 360-day year, and it's assuming what? Compounded interest instead of simple interest, as we just did with the money market yield. So the effective annual yield would be equal to 1 plus the holding period yield. Again, that holding period yield would have to be in decimal points, like 0.0482 or whatever. So 1 plus the holding period yield. We would raise that to the 365 over t. Remember, it's going to be an exponent. I'm going to raise it to the 365 over t. And then whatever result we get, we're going to subtract 1 from it. We added 1, now we're going to subtract 1, and that would give us our effective annual yield based on a 365-day year. And again, if we take that formula, the effective annual yield is equal to 1 plus the holding period yield raised to the 365 over t minus 1 at the end. We can now solve for the holding period yield. It's just math. The holding period yield would be 1 plus the effective annual yield. But now we would be de-annualizing it, right? Because we're going from an effective annual yield, which is an annual return, to a holding period yield, which is for whatever, 120, 150 days. So we would take 1 plus the effective annual yield, and we would raise it to the t over 365. And then we would subtract 1 because we are de-annualizing it. Great. If you have those formulas down, wonderful. If not, you can listen to this again and write them down. Let's do now a quick example, very quick example. Again, you can practice this on your own. Let's say you have a U.S. T-bill, a United States T-bill that has a face value of $1 million at maturity, and you can currently purchase it for $980,000. So there's basically like a discount of $20,000. And we're going to say that the time period that we're looking at is 150 days. Okay, so just 150 days. Okay, you could do this any way you want, 120 days, 130 days, 180 days, but 150 days. Okay, now, how would we calculate the holding period yield, the money market yield, and the effective annual yield based on that information? Holding period yield, very easy. P1 minus P0 over P0. Okay, so basically, or if you want to call it the face value minus the purchase price over the purchase price. So the face value at maturity is going to be $1 million. So 1 million minus the purchase price of 980,000. That would give you a difference of 20,000. And then we divide that by 980,000, the original purchase price. And we would get that the holding period yield over this 150 days is 2.042 or 2.041% approximately. That's fine. Let's say 2.041%. Okay, that would be the holding period return or the holding period yield over this 150-day period on an instrument that was bought at 980 and then sold for $1 million. Great. How do we come up then with the money market yield? Well, the money market yield is going to be that holding period yield, right? That holding period yield that we just calculated as 2.041%. And then we're going to multiply that by what? 360 over 150. Why not T over 360? Because we're not de-annualizing. We're taking the holding period yield for 150 days, and now we're going to annualize it, right? So we're increasing it. So to an annual rate. So we take the holding period yield, and we, again, simple interest. We're just going to use a 360-day year. So it's 360 over 150. So 360 over 150, if my math is correct, is 2.4. 2.4 times the holding period yield of 2.041% would give you 4.898%, or 4.89%, okay, or 4.9%, whatever. Anything around that area is correct. That would be your money market yield based on a 360-day year. Now let's do the effective annual yield. Well, since we're going from a holding period yield to an effective annual yield, we're going from 150 days, and we are annualizing it by a 365-day calendar year. So we're going to take 1 plus the holding period yield, which was 0.041%, I believe it was, or 2.042%. 1 plus that percentage, and then we're going to raise that to the 365 over 150. Notice we're not multiplying it, we are raising it. Remember, because Nathan told me the effective annual yield is compounding interest. Compounding interest requires an exponent because we're going to have interest on interest. So we're going to raise it to the 365 over 150, and then we're going to subtract 1, okay, at the end. And if you do that, 1 plus, let's say, 0.02041, raise it to the 365 over 150, and then subtract 1, you should get, obviously, an effective annual yield that's going to be higher than the money market yield, and you should get around 5.04%. Okay, you could check me on the math if you want. Again, the most important thing for you to understand here is the connection between the holding period yield, the money market yield, and the effective annual yield. And if you could do that, you don't have to memorize these formulas. Holding period yield is the actual return. 1 million minus 980 over 980. That's the return over the 150 days that I use. I'm using 150 days as an example here. That was 2.041%. The money market yield is going to take that simple interest. I'm just going to multiply by 360-day year, 360 over time, 360 over 150. And I'm basically going to get 4.898%. And that's basically, assuming simple interest and no compounding of interest, just basic arithmetic. And then the effective annual yield is going to assume a 365-day year, and it's going to assume compounded interest. That's the key point. Hope you found this helpful, and I would definitely go back to my original, video number 1 so that you could see how the bond equivalent yield works into all of this, because that's always it's a semi-annual rate times 2, okay? And if you have any questions, reach out to me. You've got my phone number and my email address on my website at chalkandboard.org. That's CHALK&AND board, BOARD. And I am sure.org. And I'm sure that I can help you with your level 1, level 2, or even level 3 exams. And I'd be happy to get you through your exam and make sure that things are made easier for you, because that's the value of an instructor. Have a great day and good luck to you.